Can language documentation contribute to improving sustainable livelihoods? In this presentation, I want to explain how a small language documentation project undertaken in the Solomon Islands in 2011-2012 has been of benefit in undertaking a larger 5-year gender equity and sustainable livelihoods project in the same community. And through this example, to suggest that closer alignment between language documentation and other social sciences projects can be of benefit to the lives of the communities we work in, and provide new avenues for linguists documenting languages and cultures. One reason for this is that poverty and disadvantage often exist in communities where endangered and minority languages are spoken. Funding bodies, including national governments, want to support opportunities for women and men to improve their livelihoods as one path to alleviating poverty. The talk is structured in the following way. I'll first provide some context to the community and livelihoods training, followed by a brief description of some of the aims and outcomes of the language documentation project. I'll provide some examples of how the people and the language focus of the documentation project are currently being utilised in the livelihoods program, and also suggest a model to reflect the way language documentation can support livelihoods training, which in turn can provide further opportunities for documentation. The livelihoods project that I'm discussing is an Australian government-funded project through the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research. It aims to adapt a family-based gender equity training program that has been successfully developed for and with Papua New Guinea communities, to adapt it to the Solomon Islands to see what changes are required, and also to assess its suitability for the Solomon Islands and other Pacific Island countries. The program is informally known as the Family Farm Teams Program. The project also explores opportunities for improving sustainable livelihoods within the community, and so far we have focused on integrating the Family Farm Team training with livelihoods training such as agricultural training and water and sanitation awareness. The training model includes workshops to a small number of community members, about 50 in this case, half women and half men from the same families. The participants then go on to train others through peer-to-peer learning. The project partner and main training organisation is an NGO, Live and Learn Environmental Education. The project has been working in the Longgu community for the past 2 years. It's located on the northeast coast of Guadalcanal, the largest island of Solomon Islands. And as noted, this is the same community where the documentation project was undertaken. One significant thing that language documentation can do is to provide information about the community context. While many communities may benefit from funded livelihood programs such as this, evidence also shows that change in the form of NGO projects and new development opportunities also have the potential to cause conflict in the community. From a linguistic perspective, you might also imagine, rightly I think, that the local languages are not always supported by projects that are funded by large donor countries and implemented by national or international NGOs. At the same time, as one of the lead partners noted about this project, the Family Farm Teams program aims to get people back to basics. For example, working together as a family, improving food security. This back to basics approach aligns well with some of the aims of language documentation, as it works within the culture of the community and within the language of the community. The project, which runs for 5 years until the end of 2024, is intended to work in 3 separate communities, but so far we have just been working in one, Longgu. From the perspective of the livelihoods training program, the Longgu community can be described as follows. It's remote and difficult to get to. It has little experience previously of training by NGOs. It's semi-subsistence with a reliance on growing vegetables for sale at markets and also for their own food, with some fishing, and of course some members of the communities work in paid employment outside of the community, but relatively speaking, this is not a great number. There's also very little money circulating in the community. which means that while men and women work hard in their garden, they're often disappointed that they cannot sell their produce locally because no one has money. And then they also find it hard to get reliable and affordable transport to take the produce to town markets. It's also a community that practices open defecation, with fewer than 10% of the community having access to a toilet for their family. From a linguistic perspective, the community speaks Longgu as their main language, and the language is transmitted to children. Education is in English, and the language of wider communication is also spoken in the community, Solomon's Pidgin. Women are less mobile than men, as there are fewer women travelling to work outside the community or studying beyond high school outside of the community. This has implications for language choice as well. The language documentation project topic and outcomes was titled Telling and Retelling, Documenting Longgu Folkloric Stories and Procedural Narratives Over Time. 3 points I'd like to make about what we learned from this and who we worked with and how they've benefited the current project. The first point is that the language documentation process identifies community members with commitment, interest, and capacity to lead within their community. The community leaders within the Livelihood project are the same people who played significant roles in the documentation project. Secondly, through the collection of stories that we did, traditional folkloric stories, we heard the stories that people tell themselves. That is, we could hear some of the assumptions and beliefs about good and bad practices within the community. Some stories, for example, are told to children to frighten them so that they'll stay close to home and not venture out of the village when their parents are in their gardens. Understanding some of these stories made it much easier to ensure that the outsider stories, that is, the messages through the livelihood workshops, reflected the stories that people already knew. In other words, that the outside stories weren't in conflict with the assumptions that people had. An example of this is a story told by Florence Perpetua about two birds, a male and female. The story is simply one of working together for the family and supporting one another. Its message is identical to the one given through the livelihood workshops on family balance and working together. Thirdly, the documentation project focused on the development of a thematic dictionary of weaving. Through the process, I learned more about a specific kind of basket used by women at the time of bride price exchange, also used in the everyday to fill with garden produce or clothing and always carried on their heads by women. As this livelihood project also has a focus on women and their families, the basket has become in some ways emblematic of their culture and has been useful in developing materials for the Livelihoods project. The documentation research also increased knowledge about gendered roles and specific objects, like the basket that I just referred to. This was reflected in also an article published on verbs of carrying in Oceanic linguistics. This knowledge and information has also been valuable in developing appropriate materials and in thinking through the research items and questions within this current project. Kinship is also something that was investigated, if you like, in certain ways within the documentation project. The research on the kinship system and clans has been closely linked to more current research on peer-to-peer learning, one aspect, as I mentioned, of the research that's been undertaken in the Livelihood project. This too was published recently in a book this past year. So I feel that it's not difficult to find links between the topics explored through language documentation projects and topics relevant to livelihood research and training. For example, in this slide, I've pointed out the way there are links between cultural practices related to food, cooking, gardens, and plants, and to agricultural training, again, looking at gardens, pests, crop rotation, soil improvement, and so on. And of course, the use of languages within the livelihood program is an essential aspect of its success or otherwise. For example, I've just noted that peer-to-peer learning is one component of the project. In order to do that well, it's important that participants have had time to learn any new skills or knowledge in their own language. Much more could be said about this, but there's not time in this presentation to elaborate on this aspect of the project. Documentation can, I believe, contribute to improving livelihoods. The work we do as linguists and as documenters of languages and cultures does have the potential to contribute to improving livelihoods by contributing to the research, contextual understanding, and personal networks relevant to livelihood programs and livelihood research. In this schematic diagram, I see both documentation and livelihoods in the blue as having the scope to explore linguistic and cultural security, which can be linked to livelihood aims to improve, for example, food security and financial security. Both documentation and livelihoods research and training typically, but not necessarily, begin with outsiders coming into the community. There are always potential issues in this, and yet the results of documentation and livelihoods training can include strengthening the community through increased knowledge and capacity building, illustrated here in the red. I think it's fair to say that while a language documentation project can contribute to the knowledge and cultural context necessary for a livelihoods project, together the two can reinforce the community's ability to strengthen their language and culture in conjunction with improving livelihoods, as reflected in the green box in this diagram. The links between documentation, livelihoods, and then strengthening and developing opportunities related to cultural practices is reflected in the following example. The documentation, as I've noted, focused in part on documenting weaving practices. Through the Livelihoods project, the community has found new opportunities for marketing their products and, for example, has the opportunity to participate in marketing them at the 2023 Pacific Games. Opportunities like this reinforce the value of maintaining cultural practices and skills and were not open to them before this recent training. And finally, I'd like to note that we could have new directions in terms of language documentation and something like agricultural training. As I noted earlier, NGO training and projects often focus on change, and this change has the potential to cause problems as well as benefits. One of the changes in agricultural practices that has been introduced to the community recently is that of crop rotation. This has benefits for soil fertility and food security. At the same time, the traditional way of planting crops in this area is in rows. Indeed, one of the topics that I learned more about through our documentation project was the oceanic practice of counting specific objects, including garden rows by tens, which is very clear in the slide of this garden that you see now. I wonder to what extent there will be further loss of such counting practices if crop rotation is practiced more widely. It seems to me that one direction for language documentation in the future is to work with agricultural and livelihood organisations implementing new practices to document the old ways as well as the new. In conclusion, I and the community think that there are good synergies between language documentation and livelihood programs, and that it is worthwhile further exploring how these approaches can be beneficial to the maintenance of language and cultural practices. Thank you.